So let's think about epilepsy as our first condition we're going to look at. In one of the work readings, I think 254, that's work readings, isn't it? Elaine, you could probably tell me, that's a work reading. At the, actually, there's a reading right before this, 254.81, I usually include this. That's the one where he says, you call it research and enlightenment, but how much research do you really do? Don't get the cart before the horse. In other words, just don't take it as truth. You got to research it. That was 254.81. So the very next reading, and this is toward the end of the reading, and it's coming out of nowhere. They're not asking about this at all. He volunteers it out of the blue. He says, again, we would insist that this organization may give much to the world on one particular disturbance that has baffled the wise and the foolish. This study on that called epilepsy for 3 years, and you will be undefeatable. Wow. Just out of the blue, he said that. Now, we took Edgar Cayce as where we formed a study group back about 10 years ago, and we went through over 100 epilepsy readings. We studied about 3.5 years. That was the part of the genesis of Meridian Institute. Doug and Carl and I were 3 people in that group, in the study group, epilepsy study group. Along then Eric became part of it, and we picked up on he had already formed the corporation, but without the real organization. You had the legal corporation without really the organization. And we came together and formed Meridian Institute, but it came out of this reading. It came out of this concept, study epilepsy for 3 years and be undefeatable. So we kid ourselves a little bit from time to time. Are we undefeatable yet? And epilepsy is still one of our leading focuses for research, particularly this abdominal cold spot, which I'll talk about in a moment. In fact, here it is right here. From every condition that is of true epileptic nature, there will be found a cold spot or area between the lacteal duct and the cecum. Every condition of a true epileptic. Now, that's the language again. True. What does he mean by true? When you go back and look at even the history of epilepsy, they didn't talk about idiopathic. About 60 to 70% of most conditions will be labeled as idiopathic. That means we don't know what causes it. It's not caused by some other disease or whatever. It's not secondary to another disease. It's primary, and it's a core group, and we don't know what causes it. In Cayce's time, it was called true or pure. So if you wanted that same group of 60 to 70% of epilepsy of unknown causation, true epilepsy, that's what he's referring to. Now, the other major group is symptomatic epilepsy, and that's when you get banged on the head or an accident, a car accident, or there's a tumor, it's organic. You can say, there it is, that's causing it, you know, and that's what's producing the seizures. Well, that's symptomatic, but that's a small group. At best 30%, and maybe much less than that. But at least 60 to 70% is idiopathic. We got these seizures in the brain, and we don't know what's causing it. We really don't know. So Edgar Cayce says, in all cases of true epilepsy, you'll find this cold spot on the right side of the abdomen, which is about this area from the lacteal ducts to the cecum. That's where you're going to put the hot castor oil packs that he said would break up those adhesions in the lacteal ducts better than almost anything else. And then you tend to find, he said, make it as hot as you can stand and give it that massage. He gave a specific massage pattern for breaking up the adhesions in the lacteal ducts. And he says the lacteal ducts, there's something about this area. Remember, this is where we put the large nickel disc with the wet cell, right over the lacteal ducts on the right side of the abdomen. He said there's something about those atomic vibratory energies associated with that part of the body that somehow is coordinating between the abdominal brain and this part of the system and this brain. And it's an incoordination. Somehow a short circuit's out there, and the seizure eventually ends up in this brain, but it starts down here as an incoordination of the nervous systems. Hot castor oil packs over the right side of the abdomen. Now, almost always for epilepsy, that's where it is. Sometimes he would recommend, like I showed earlier, for a spleen problem, he said, well, get it over the liver and the spleen. In some cases where there's a colon problem, he'd say, you know, get it over the transverse colon or something. So the castor oil packs can go in various places, but in epilepsy, in virtually every case, it's on the right side of the abdomen where he says this cold spot is. So we set out to try to measure it using liquid crystal thermography. It's a form of thermography just studying temperature variations, and this particular device has a sheet of plastic, and it changes color with temperature. So you can lay it on the abdomen or lay it on the back, and over a minute or two, the colors come out. And the more the brown is the cooler, and toward the green and blue is warmer. So you see on the left one here, the cold spot I pointed out to you. See how it's kind of circular and almost kind of has a little thing hanging down from it? Can you see? Right here. And it's hard to see on this screen, but if you get a good resolution, there's a navel. That's a cold spot because there's a hole. I mean, it's indented there, so that's cool. But see that cold spot there? And the lacteals are in this area. The cecum is probably about here. The liver and the last rib is up here. So this is the area for the castor oil pack on the right side of the abdomen. That's an adult woman with epilepsy for many years. And on the other side is another, I pointed out to you. Can you see the cold spot there? That's another woman. Developed epilepsy as an adult after she had a skiing accident, injured her tailbone. Her tailbone was sore for months. She could hardly sit on it. And within 18 months or so, she started having seizures. There's a lot of readings, and Cayce readings on epilepsy, where it starts with that tailbone injury. Reflex up from the coccyx. He said it would throw the system out of balance again, create those adhesions in the lacteal ducts on the right side of the abdomen, short circuit out the nervous system. We had a conference where we had 3 people come with epilepsy. These are 2 adult women. See the spots there again on the right side of the abdomen? Again, almost like a little protrusion here, kind of circular with almost a little protrusion. See it here? And then this one had quite a bit of coldness, but clearly the biggest area of coldness is right there to the side of the navel on the one side. And then we had a couple people more recently to show up, and for them, there was a little bit of coolness above the navel up in this area, but it's not nearly as strong. And so whether or not this qualifies, one of these people had brain surgery. There was a lesion in the brain, so whether or not it would qualify as the type of true epilepsy. Cayce was talking about more of a symptomatic epilepsy. But basically in 2/3, 3/4 of the people that we sampled in our very small sample, there was a pretty clear cold spot on the right side of the abdomen. And we actually tested over 80 people as part of our research programs, coming through with all kinds of different diagnoses, from migraine to chronic fatigue and asthma and so forth, and multiple sclerosis. We did this sort of thing, and we didn't really see that pattern of cold spot, except in migraine. There was one lady that was having EEGs of seizures along with her migraine, and she had a nice big cold spot there on the right side as well. Interesting. That'll make more sense to you after I tell you about migraine. Okay, so what is it about the right side of the abdomen that's so interesting? And with those lacteal ducts, over here on the left side, I took that from an old osteopathic manual. That was back before they probably had some of the imaging devices we have now. And that pretty much shows the lymphatics as being bilaterally symmetrical. In other words, well, the right and left kind of look alike. You got a little bit more right in here, right? A little bit more maybe than over here. And maybe a little, I don't know, maybe, but it's pretty much bilaterally symmetrical. These are from recent physiological text. Look at this on the right side. Look at this in the lymphatics, like a little racetrack there. Isn't it? See that little circular, little elongated kind of thing on the right side of the abdomen? And look over here on this one. Definitely not bilaterally symmetrical. You get more of a circular pattern in the lymphatics. The lacteals are part of the lymphatic system, by the way. So in case he says there'll be a cold spot, and he'll actually, in many, many readings, he describes this. You can look under the lacteal duct adhesions and epilepsy, and over, he keeps describing these adhesions and a cold spot on the right side of the abdomen. There they are, see? Okay, so here's the quote I showed you earlier. What's so interesting about this, he's calling this area the solar plexus brain. Those centers about the umbilicus, which are the electronic and atomic vibratory radiations of a human body. This area where you put, in this context, he's talking about where you put the plate with the appliances on the right side of the abdomen, but it's right over that area, very close to where we're talking about with the cold spot. Okay? And when he does this, he called this the lacteal duct. He says, put the large nickel plate over the lacteal duct plexus on the right side of the abdomen. 3 fingers over, sometimes 1 or 2 fingers up. So what is going on there? And I've told you before about Byron Robinson, the abdominal and pelvic brain. Well, that's basically one way of thinking about it. There's a whole nervous system going on there. I love that text. Basically what he said was, he says, this whole book is a treatise on the great sympathetic nervous system. So when I talked earlier this morning about the sympathetic system, the brain of the soul, and all the 3 faces of the sympathetic, this whole 671 pages, basically, he says, it's just a treatise on the sympathetic system to appreciate what it is. And it's exactly the same kind of system Edgar Cayce is describing, the same terminology, and so forth and so on. Fantastic book. And that's all on the internet on our website. I put the whole book and all the illustrations on our website, by the way, on Meridian Institute website. Okay, the enteric nervous system. When you come up to date and you go on Medline, you'll find over 600 references on Medline, which is the main the main medical database. Over 600 references on the enteric nervous system. Enteric, the gut. Enteric. And what they're saying about that in the mainstream literature is that the current concept of the enteric nervous system is that of a mini brain placed in close proximity to the effector systems it controls. Remember, Ryan Robinson talked about levels of government, the national government, the state government, the local government, when they're calling it a mini brain in close proximity. And many substances are found in both the bowel and the brain, a coincidence that strikes most observers as intrinsically interesting. About a third of your nervous system is in your gut, in this enteric nervous system. So you think about how much of your nervous system, think about that. We usually think the brain, you know, all of our nerve cells are there, and maybe a few kind of along the spinal column. A third of your nervous system in your body is in your gut, in the lining of your alimentary canal. That's the enteric nervous system, the gut brain. And the other thing we found when you look in the modern literature is that there's a number of articles about abdominal epilepsy. So this idea that epilepsy could somehow be related to something in the abdomen, as Edgar Cayce kept insisting, there's a lot of articles. I mean, and basically what it amounts to is people with epilepsy have a lot of abdominal symptoms. And very often those abdominal symptoms precede the seizure. It's called a premonition or an aura. A premonition usually is longer before, sometimes up to several hours before. They'll have constipation, diarrhea, indigestion, nausea, funny feeling in the pit of their stomach. Something's going on in the abdomen, and within a few hours they have their seizure, and they know the two are connected. They know when they have that feeling they're going to have a seizure. If it happens right at the beginning of the seizure, it's called an aura instead of a premonition. And an aura is actually part of the seizure, or it's a mini seizure that precedes the big seizure. The most common aura is a funny feeling in the abdomen. Now here's a recent article by a couple of researchers. I've communicated with these guys. I think it's, one of them is a neurologist and the other is a gastroenterologist. So you got a stomach doctor, digestive doctor, and a neurologist. Nice combination. You see why they would be interested. And they've done a couple of studies and published it, and they've shown that although abdominal epilepsy most often occurs in children when it's diagnosed, and very often it's diagnosed because the abdominal features are the prominent features. And you might not even know they were having seizures if you didn't have them on the EEG, but it's the abdominal seizure, the aura is so predominant with so many gastric and intestinal kind of problems that gets it diagnosed as abdominal epilepsy. And they're saying it's not entirely clear that in the first place they say the spectrum of abdominal epilepsy in adults. They did a couple articles where they surveyed this and they say, hey, it's not just in children, there's a lot more of this in adults than anybody's aware of, this abdominal epilepsy. Shades of Cayce, huh? And not only that, they're saying that we assume that these symptoms are being produced by this brain, the seizures here, and the nerve impulse comes from here to the abdomen, and that's what causes the abdominal symptoms. But they're saying just as well it could be in the abdomen and through the vagus nerve. You've heard me talk about the vagus this morning. 70% of that pneumogastric vagus nerve impulse is going in this direction. It's going from the viscera in the abdomen toward the brain. It's mostly sensory, most of the impulse, 70%. And they're saying, hey, maybe that's what's going on with these cases of abdominal epilepsy, even in adults. Maybe the problem's in the abdomen, and through the vagus it's being referred up to the brain and producing a seizure. Just exactly the kind of model Cayce was talking about. As I mentioned earlier, very often the problem Cayce would trace back to some kind of spinal subluxation. The coccyx was very common, but wasn't the only one. Sometimes, now, in some of the osteopaths would say, look to the cervical, and particularly the chiropractors. Obviously got a brain problem and you're going to attribute to something in the spine, go for the neck, right? It's right close. Well, there are a couple of those, but I really appreciate some of the old osteopaths. They kept meticulous records, particularly Charles Hazard, one of the early osteopaths that was very well known and very respected. And he gives case reports, and he gives a case report of a coccyx injury where there's a lesion in the coccyx, corrected the coccyx, and the seizures went away. And sometimes he'd say it would be farther up, even in the mid-thoracic, right there close to the lacteal ducts would be the problem, and sometimes farther up in the spine. Let me back up just a moment, to talk about this vagus nerve. An interesting thing has happened in recent years. When they have intractable epilepsy, doesn't respond to the regular treatments, drug treatments and so forth, Well, one of the options is to do radical surgery and cut the brain in half, the corpus callosum, or remove a big chunk of the brain, or at least or a small part of the brain, but to do something pretty radical with surgery. And what they discovered was if they implant a pacemaker right here on the vagus nerve on the left side, the vagus, the wandering nerve that comes down, and the cranial nerve and sort of wanders through the whole upper part of the abdomen and innervates those organs. And as it comes down the spine and comes through left and right and comes like here, if they put a pacemaker right on the vagus nerve in people with intractable epilepsy, very often the seizures will decrease dramatically or go away entirely, just from a pacemaker on the vagus. Sending a regular sensory input to the brain is enough. Now, what does that mean? Could it be that it's sort of getting in the way of sort of blocking this incoordination that starts in the stomach as a seizure, and it can't quite make it up the vagus? It gets, whatever is causing. By the way, a seizure, what is happening there is a synchrony of the firing of the nerves in the brain. The neurons are firing at the same time. That's what produces a seizure. So whatever it is that's putting the brain into that kind of pattern, maybe this is sort of interfering with that. The osteopaths had a less invasive way of doing it, that they said if you can see the seizure coming on, put a piece of ice at the base of the brain. And very often that will stop the seizure or make it less or decrease it. Well, the vagus comes right up and comes right up along the neck here in this area where you put the ice. And Cayce also recommended, you may have seen that in Cayce readings where he said put a piece of ice. Actually, I found it earlier in the osteopathic literature before I found it in the Cayce. It's chronologically, it precedes the Cayce reading. So he's obviously tapping into that. And I've actually worked with some people with children with seizures, not responding to anything else. Piece of ice, if they sense the aura or the premonition, they know it's going to be coming on, put a piece of ice there and the seizure won't happen or it'll be much less. This vagus nerve, isn't that interesting? And let me give you one other idea that we're just becoming aware of with epilepsy. It's called reflex epilepsy. Seizures can be produced by all kinds of reflexes, usually to the sensory system. So flashing light, certain kinds of music, even a smell, almost anything can become that trigger that puts the brain into that seizure mode where all the neurons start firing at the same time. It just so happens that included in that is digestive epilepsy, what they call, a little bit different than abdominal epilepsy, but eating certain foods or even chewing the foods, but eating them and getting them in the digestive system is one of the things that can produce epileptic seizures. So what we're sort of our novel idea, and it's not entirely novel because I've actually found in the literature, is the concept of visceral reflex epilepsy. That maybe what Cayce was describing was a reflex epilepsy where the main sensation is coming from the abdomen, from the digestive system, the abdominal brain, whatever you want to call it, the enteric nervous system, through the vagus, and that's the source. So it's a reflex pattern. It's a visceral reflex epilepsy. Now I searched on that because I thought, wow, I've come up with a new concept, and I went on the internet and typed that in, and here come a hospital records showing the amount of diagnoses for a month, in terms of how many of this and how many of that. And one of the things they were listing was visceral reflex epilepsy, is how many cases of this have we had? Not very often, but you could think of all of these, all those symptoms, those predominance of symptoms of abdominal features in epilepsy. Maybe that's part of a visceral reflex pattern. Maybe that's what we're looking at. So we're going to submit an application next month, actually this month now, it's coming up within 2 weeks, to a National Epilepsy Organization for a grant proposal to see if they'll give us some money to study that idea. Okay, so what do you do in cases of epilepsy from the Cayce perspective? Well, we've already talked about the castor oil packs. Manual therapy, obviously, if you've got these reflexes causing a problem. Diet, and one of the treatments that's become pretty popular in recent years is the ketogenic diet. Are you familiar with the ketogenic diet, the high-fat diet? For intractable epilepsy, if they don't respond to the drugs, then what are your options? Well, the ketogenic diet. It's been around for a long time, particularly at Johns Hopkins. There was a movie a couple years ago with Meryl Streep and some other actors based on the ketogenic diet for epilepsy, and now people are very interested in it. Well, the high-fat diet, that's what the lacteals do. Those lacteal ducts where Cayce said the adhesions, they absorb fats off the intestinal tract. So maybe that's what the ketogenic diet does. You're just flooding the system. It produces ketosis, to be sure. That can affect the nervous system. But maybe it has something to do with when you just have fats coming through those lacteals, maybe they draw enough circulation to help lessen the adhesions. You increase the circulation by assimilating all these fats through the lacteals. One idea. An herbal remedy called the passion flower infusion, and it's just a mild sedative, natural sedative, Cayce recommended. Spirituality is a big part of almost all these programs. We emphasize what is your purpose for being healed, what's your attitude, trying to work with the divine within that is the source of all healing. The ice at the base of the brain, either during the seizure or right at the beginning usually, and suggestive therapeutics, which is a form of natural hypnosis, particularly for children as a treatment for epilepsy. We published an article, I wrote an article and we got it published in a Medline journal, the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine, so if you're interested in that, that's on our website, on the abdominal brain enteric nervous system, where we focused on abdominal epilepsy, abdominal migraine, and autism, and how that could be another way of looking at these neurological disorders.